Several years ago, an old lady was refused entry to the Windsor Horse Show. She turned up without a ticket and tried to get in. And in the way that sort of bouncers do, the security team do, they say, show me your ticket. And she said, haven't got a ticket. And they say, you can't come in here, love, without a ticket. And her reply was, well, if you check, I might be allowed in if you check. And they said, sorry, love, you need a ticket if you're going to come in to the horse show. And one thing led to another, and they did eventually let her in, because it turns out that if you're the Queen, you don't need a ticket for these types of things. And the poor security guard had to check. Well, you can have an exception if you're the Queen. You don't need a ticket. In some sense, this passage revolves around something of that, something of the privileges, the question of who Jesus is, and then the privileges that entails, all that means in light of who Jesus is. And as we look at the passage, we'll look at three things, three parts of the story today. The first is the charge against Jesus. The charge against Jesus. That's particularly verses 1 to 2. The charge against Jesus in this passage focuses around what is and what isn't allowed on the Sabbath day. On the Sabbath. Now, the Sabbath, as a reminder, was the seventh day of the week. It was the Saturday which Jews observed under the Old Testament law. The fourth commandment, the fourth of the Ten Commandments, said they were to remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy. They were to worship God, and they were to rest from their labors. And then in addition to that commandment, in the Ten Commandments, there were various other laws that came in to regulate exactly what that looked like. They were to rest and to worship on the Sabbath. Now, it's going to be really important for us to know that the Sabbath pre-existed the Old Testament law. That's going to be really important as we think about how we apply it today, what it sort of looks like for us. We know that the Sabbath was not so bound up with the Old Testament law that it just came in Exodus 20. How do I know that? Because 16 is before 20. And in Exodus 20, the Sabbath command is given, but in Exodus 16, you see them obeying or not obeying the Sabbath command. So they were clearly keeping it already. And we see all the way back in Eden, right back at the beginning of the Bible, in the pre-fall world, God instituted the Sabbath. He rested on the seventh day, and he hallowed the day. He made it holy, and he rested. And that's why the Jews in their weekly calendar were to observe a seventh day of rest and of worship, because in creation, God had done that same thing. He had hallowed the day, and he had rested. So it's going to be important for us as we think about it to know that the Sabbath command was not just tied up with the Old Testament law. It pre-existed the Old Testament law, and as we'll see, it lasts a bit longer than the Old Testament law, but we'll get to that bit. I don't want to spoil the punchline. But we need to know it's not just tied up with the giving of the law to Moses on Mount Sinai. But for the Pharisees, the ruling elite, what Jesus was doing and what Jesus' disciples was doing was breaking the Sabbath command. Look at verse 1. At that time, Jesus went through the cornfields on the Sabbath, the Saturday. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some ears of corn and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." Verse 10 has a similar thing, looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus. They asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" They're trying to bring a charge against Jesus, a case against him, all to do with what is and what isn't allowed to happen on the Sabbath day, on the Saturday. But it's based on their interpretation of the law. As we saw this morning with the Pharisees, it wasn't just that they were really zealous for keeping God's law. They were keeping God's law and then all of their own laws on top of it. The Old Testament said that you weren't allowed to work on the Sabbath. But verse 1, what are the disciples doing? Are they working? Are they harvesters? Are they farmers? No, they were walking by, eating. Were you allowed to eat on the Sabbath day? Yes, you were allowed to eat. In fact, Deuteronomy allows for this very situation of being able to walk along and take bits of food from somebody's field in case you were walking. You're allowed to do that. The Pharisees were criticizing Jesus, claiming that he was breaking the Sabbath law, but actually he wasn't breaking the Sabbath law, he was breaking their laws, their interpretation, all the various laws that they'd put out. But they wanted to catch Jesus. They want to make a case against him. They're bringing a charge against him. But the issue in the passage is not really a discussion of the minutiae of the Old Testament law. It's a discussion of who Jesus is, of his identity. And Jesus turns the discussion away from a discussion of the very complicated details to a discussion as to who he is. And that takes us to the second point, the credentials of Jesus. Jesus is going to show us his credentials. He's going to show us his identity, who he is. And he does it in this passage from two examples, two episodes from Israel's history. And he does it to show why his disciples were not wrong in what they did. The first lesson is David and his followers. So verse 3. Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. The issue here is David in the Old Testament, he did what he shouldn't have done. He ate the consecrated bread, which he should not have done. But the key thing is, the Bible never condemns him for doing that. The Bible never says, God never says that he did wrong. It was okay to do that. There was need for it. He was hungry. David was the anointed king. You could make an exception. Strictly speaking, it was not lawful for him to do it, but it was okay to do that. There was a need for it to happen. It was common sense. And in the same way, Jesus says, just as David could eat the consecrated bread and that was okay, so too he and his disciples can pick bits of corn on the Sabbath. In condemning Jesus, the Pharisees are stricter than the Bible is. They're stricter than God is, because God doesn't condemn David, and therefore they shouldn't condemn Jesus. That's the argument that he's making. Now, in saying that, he's making an assumption, isn't he? Jesus is assuming that he is at least as great as David to be making that case. Jesus is saying that he is superior, that he is greater even than King David. That song that we just sang, he is David's son in David's family, but he's David's Lord. He rules over David. He is greater than David. Jesus is the fulfillment of God's promises. Now, I know that we're not looking at Matthew's gospel. We've sort of parachuted halfway through it. Fulfillment, Jesus fulfilling the scriptures, is a huge part of Matthew's gospel. Matthew has written it to show that Christ is the fulfillment of all the Old Testament promises. Jesus is the king in David's family, like David, who can do what David did. And in fact, just like David was loved by the crowds and yet rejected by the leaders, just like David flees for his life from Saul, and in verse 15 and verse 14 it says the Pharisees want to kill Jesus and he withdraws from them. In the same way, so too Jesus is the fulfillment of all of God's promises. This is called typology, that David is a type of Christ. That David is a type of Christ. Jesus is the antitype. He's the true reality. David is the type. He's the pointer to Jesus. Types and antitypes work where the antitype is the sort of the reality, the fulfillment, is the crescendo. It's the sort of climax to everything, and the types point to Jesus. And Jesus is the fulfillment of that, the sort of the escalation of that, the climax of what's come before. It's a bit like if you're watching a crime drama, and sometimes perhaps at the beginning of the crime drama, the camera will pan across the room and it slightly lingers on something. Perhaps it'll linger on the candlestick, and you think, oh, I wonder if that's going to be significant later on, because it sort of makes a bit too much of it. Or perhaps later on in the episode, some of the key people are saying something. There's some dialogue happening, and one of them says something, oh, that's a bit unusual. Why did he say that? I bet that's going to be significant later on. Have you ever do that when you sort of, oh, I bet that's going to be significant. And then later on, it is significant. That's why he said it. We're giving us a little clue. Well, not in exactly the same way, but in some way, that is what the Bible is showing us. The stories in the Old Testament find their fulfillment, find their climax, their crescendo in Jesus. And once we know that, it makes sense of all that's gone before. When we reread the Old Testament, we think, yeah, that's pointing me to Jesus. I see why that's here now, because it's pointing me on the journey. It finds its fulfillment in Christ. The first lesson that Jesus gives is David and the bread. And he says, in the same way that David was allowed to eat the bread, even though strictly speaking it wasn't the right thing to do, there was need, so too I am allowed to eat on the Sabbath day. That's the first lesson he gives. The second lesson is to do with the priests and the temple, and that's in verse 5. He goes on to say, haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? Now, what's he talking about here? Well, what weren't you allowed to do on the Sabbath? Well, of all the key thing you weren't allowed to do was work. You weren't allowed to work on the Sabbath. What were the priests doing on the Sabbath? They were working. Oh, they were desecrating the Sabbath. They were breaking the Sabbath, weren't they? Well, of course, the point is they had to do that. The people were meant to rest and to worship, and to lead them in the worship, they had to work, the priests. That's okay. Verse 5 says, they were innocent. They desecrate the Sabbath, and yet they're innocent. God doesn't condemn them. In fact, he says, verse 7, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Jesus is saying it is not all about external obedience to the minutiae of the Old Testament law. Mercy was needed. Justice, doing the right thing. You could even say common sense, doing the right thing. Of course the priests were to work on the Sabbath. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Mercy, not strict obedience that is not merciful. Now, a few years ago, back in the COVID times, England were playing a friendly, I think it was, against Iceland. The country, not the supermarket. And two England players, Phil Foden and Mason Greenwood, were kicked out of the England squad. And they were kicked out of the England squad for breaching COVID regulations. Do you remember the bubbles? This is bringing it all back now, isn't it? The bubbles you had to be in. You weren't allowed to sort of breach the bubbles. Well, the England football squad, their team and the managers, they were part of a sort of big bubble, and they weren't allowed to go out of the hotel. They weren't allowed to sort of liaise with people in the public, otherwise that was sort of breaking the bubble. And these two England footballers did exactly that. They met some members of the public, they breached COVID regulations, and they were sent back home. They couldn't play for England. Now, they breached the regulations. But imagine that they hadn't breached the regulations. They were sat in their hotel room waiting for the game, and they look out the window, and they see on the street in front of them an old lady being mugged. Imagine that they see that. What should they do? These are two fit young lads. They can chase off an attacker. Should they just stay in the hotel because they're not meant to leave the hotel, COVID regulations, in the bubble? What should they do? Well, we know the answer, don't we? Of course they should help. Why? Because it's common sense. It's mercy. It's justice. It's doing the right thing. That's what's going on here. Jesus is saying Jesus and his disciples, they weren't breaking the Old Testament law. But even if they were, that's not the point. The point is mercy. The point is compassion. Common sense, you might say. They were doing the right thing. That's the intended outcome. Not merely just external obedience to the letter of the rules. What does God say through Hosea? Verse 7, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. You might say he did desire sacrifice, didn't he? Yeah, he commanded it in the Old Testament. The thing he wanted most was mercy, was justice, was doing the right thing. Now, He's given two examples, two lessons from Israel's history. But the bigger point that he's making is not a discussion about the minutiae of the law and what they could and couldn't do. He says, verse 6, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. That's the point he wants to make. It's who he is. It's his identity. He is greater than the temple. If you remember, the temple was the dwelling place of God and humanity, a place where God came to be with his people, and Jesus is the fulfillment of that. Or you could put it in another way, the temple is the type of Jesus. It points us to Jesus, the place where God came to be with his people. That is now fulfilled in Jesus. He has tabernacled amongst us, come to dwell with his people. Just like we saw last Sunday morning in Mark 2, when Tom was preaching, the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And yet Jesus is God on earth with the authority to forgive sins. God come amongst his people. And because he's the fulfillment of the temple, because he's greater than David, he has authority. He has authority over the Sabbath laws. What does he say? He says that he is Lord of the Sabbath. Verse 8, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. He can redefine Sabbath. He can redefine the law. Why? We can't do that, because he is the Lord of the Sabbath. Greater than the temple, greater than David, God himself. In the same way that we can't get into the Windsor Horse Show without a ticket, but the Queen could. We can't change the Sabbath regulations. The Pharisees can't change the Sabbath regulations. Who can? The Lord of the Sabbath, Jesus himself. Now, there are a number of implications for us today when it comes to the Sabbath. We're just going to slightly park this bit of the story and think about how do we apply this today. Well, first of all, because Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath, that means that the Sabbath continues today. You might think that's a slightly strange thing to say, and it probably isn't the type of thing that you hear very often. There are many evangelicals who are wonderful evangelicals who think that the Sabbath was, because it was part of Israel's law and we're now not under law, therefore the Sabbath command has sort of ceased in that sense. Like it was sort of just for Israel in the Old Testament, in their law, and because we're not under that law, we're not under the Sabbath law anymore. And I respect that opinion. It's wrong. But I do respect it, and probably it's fair to say, maybe that's your sort of instinct. It may be that that's the church you've grown up in. It's probably the majority view in our types of churches today. I think that's fair to say. Maybe you can tell me off if that's not the case, but I think that probably is the case. But I don't think it's quite right. And I don't think it's quite right because I think if Jesus had said that he is the Lord of the Sabbath, and what he actually meant was, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath for the next year and a half until the Old Testament law comes to an end, and then I'm no longer Lord of the Sabbath, that would be a strange thing to say. The fact that he says he is Lord over it, and he is still Lord, the exalted Lord, I think implies that there's an ongoingness to his lordship over the Sabbath. That it does not come to an end because the Sabbath law has come to an end. And as we mentioned earlier, the Sabbath command was not just tied up to the law, it existed in Eden, pre-giving the law. And not just that, there are passages in Isaiah, for example, which speak of the new covenant to come, where Isaiah says, in those days, my people will call the Sabbath a delight. They will keep the Sabbath. Sabbath observance wasn't just in the Old Testament law, it was before that, and the Old Testament itself speaks of a time where God's people will keep the Sabbath. I think at a most basic level, God gave 10 commandments, not 9. You may think that's not a very good argument, but I think it is actually quite a good argument. 9 out of the 10 commandments that we're given in Exodus 20, 9 out of the 10 are quoted in the New Testament as being binding for God's people, all people everywhere. The Sabbath command isn't explicitly given. But there's a phrase, isn't there, in for a penny, in for a pound. I think the burden of proof is that if you've got 9 out of the 10 quoted in the New Testament, I think the likelihood of that fourth commandment, the Sabbath command, being binding as well is pretty high, I would have thought. And not just that, the Ten Commandments are given as a separate part of the Old Testament law. They're given in a different way, in a unique way to the rest of the law. Christians are not under law. We're under grace. But we all agree, right, that we shouldn't murder. Yeah? There's some lack of nodding of heads. It's a bit worrying. We all know that idolatry is wrong. We all know that stealing is wrong. We know that the Ten Commandments are different to the various commands about sort of what clothes you should wear and sort of having tassels and all. We know that there are different types of laws. God gave 10, not 9. And I think it is fair to say that the fourth commandment, the Sabbath command, still is in existence. But that raises the question, well, what does that exactly mean? Because Jesus, as Lord of the Sabbath, is able to redefine the day. And that's why Christians in the New Testament didn't meet on a Saturday, they met on a Sunday. Why? Because Jesus, as Lord of the Sabbath, changed the day. He changed the day of rest and worship from the seventh day to the first day of the new week, the eighth day, the next week, the Sunday, not the Saturday. In the same way that in the Old Testament, the Sabbath day was rooted in creation, God resting in creation, the Christian Sabbath, the New Covenant Sabbath, is rooted in the new creation, a resurrection from the dead on the first day of the new week. Now, of course, the various laws with the severity and all the various regulations as to exactly what that looked like, we are not under those laws. But the principle remains, as it did in Eden, of rest and of worship. Hallowing the day, as God did in Eden, and of resting and worship. So if you can only remember this, the Sabbath day is now the Lord's day, because Jesus, as Lord of the Sabbath, has changed it to become the Lord's day, and it is a day of rest and of worship. It's a day of blessing, not a burden, a day of blessing for God's people to be refreshed, both physically and spiritually, and to show mercy. And that is exactly what Jesus does in this final point, the compassion of Jesus. God desires mercy, not sacrifice. And so Jesus is going to show that. He is going to demonstrate the mercy, the compassion, the love of God. Mercy, love, tenderness, these are marks of the ministry of the Lord Jesus. And he shows it again on the Sabbath day. Verse 9, going on from that place, he went to their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they said, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. This was what the Sabbath was for. This is exactly why God gave the Sabbath. And it was instituted back in Eden. It was instituted in a pre-fall world as a blessing, not as a curse, not to sort of squash people's enjoyment, not to trip people up, but a blessing for God's people, to rest from their labors and to worship. It was a day for good. No wonder Jesus says, verse 11, "Look, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into the pit, don't you take it out? Don't you do what's right, what's good, what's merciful on that day? Of course you do that." Various Reformed confessions talk about works of necessity. Good little phrase. Works of necessity. Things that you just have to do. Okay, you might want to rest on the day. You might want to set aside the day of for rest and worship, but sometimes there are some things you just have to do. They're necessary for you, necessary for life, necessary for you and for the good of others. The day is to do good to other people, to bless others, to be a blessing, not a burden. Definitely do good on the Sabbath day. Jesus says, if your sheep falls down a pit, pick it up. You don't just say, well, it's a day of rest, I'm not going to do something good. You do something good, he says. It's a day of restoration. And that's exactly what Jesus does in this healing. He says, verse 13, stretch out your hand. The man stretches it out, and what happens? It's restored. It's made new. That is what the Lord's Day is for restoration, for refreshment, for life to come. It's for good to happen. It happens physically here on this Sabbath day, but it happens spiritually. Having Sunday as the Lord's Day to keep is a blessing for God's people. It's not a burden. It's a blessing where they can find refreshment for their bodies, where they can find refreshment for their souls, where we can be built up, encouraged, rejoicing. It's a day of life to come for God's people. No wonder the Old Testament says they can call it a delight. And don't you find that to be the case? When you meet with God's people, when you go to church and perhaps you've sung God's praises, or you've heard from God's word, or you've chatted with one another, you've had fellowship with God's people, aren't you built up? Aren't you encouraged when that happens? Aren't you better spiritually speaking, in the subjective sense, when you leave the building than when you came? It's what the day is for, to be refreshed and restored spiritually. One of my kids the other day, as they were going to bed, said, Daddy, why do we need to sleep? It's very hard in those moments to know whether it's a stalling tactic or whether it's a genuine sort of existential question. I can see little kids here. I'm sure you're never like that. But sometimes you have to sort of think the best, don't you? And we entered into a conversation about why we need rest and why we need sleep. Now, some people find it very hard to sleep. And perhaps that's been your experience. You know it's really difficult to get to sleep. It's really hard, but we all need it. And in fact, when you think about it, we spend a lot of our lives asleep, don't we? A huge part of our lives asleep. When you think, why did God make us to sleep? If he'd made us without the need for sleep, we could be so much more productive. Think of how much more time we could have 2 jobs. Or we could all be having a job and then working in the church. You could do so much more stuff if we didn't have to sleep. But of course, we sleep because we are not God. We're creatures. We need rest. God rested on the 7th day. He didn't need to rest, did he? He wasn't tired. He rested. We get tired. We need to rest. That's why we needed to take time to stop, to be refreshed, because we need to. It's part of what it means to be a creature. And God, in his kindness, has said there's a particular day that can be a blessing, not a burden, not a day to worry about what we can and can't do, but a day to meet together, a day to praise God together, a day to be restored and to receive life from him, to rest from our labors and to receive life from Christ in his word. All days belong to Jesus. But there is one day in particular that belongs to him, that he is the Lord over. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And because he rose on it, we rest from our labors and we hallow the day and worship. Let's pray, and then we'll stand and sing. Father, we thank you for your Son, Jesus, who has perfectly fulfilled the Old Testament. Thank you that the condemnation of the law, the severity of the law has been taken away. Thank you that Christ has kept it in a way that we could never. But thank you that you have given various moral commands which are for our good as human beings. We thank you for the opportunity that we have, the blessing that we have on a Sunday to come together and to worship your Son Jesus. We thank you that the New Testament refers to this day as the Lord's Day. We thank you that on it, on that first Easter Sunday, Jesus rose from the dead. We thank you that there has been a new creation. A man has come back from the dead. We thank you that we one day will come back from the dead and that we will enter the new creation. And Father, we long for that to be the case. But in the meantime, in this life here, help us to rest well and to praise you, knowing that you deserve all the glory, that your Son is Lord of the Sabbath. And for that we praise you and we thank you. Amen.